And we have with us on the phone as a special treat, Mr. David Ferguson. Welcome to the show.
Good morning.
So, we have, of course, talked on the show extensively about the corruption in Arkansas. I mean, now we have the new legislation, and they want us to believe that it's all over, it's all taken care of, there's nothing to see here. But what's your opinion on that?
Well, first of all, kind of give a perspective of how I look at it. I'm looking at it as a historical perspective of what's been going on in Arkansas for 40 years or more. And let me say that I worked for the legislature for 32 years, writing legislation beginning in 1980, and ended up being director of the research agency for the legislature. And in 2012, I retired, but I've continued to keep up by writing some articles for Conduit for Action, usually on something like ethics or Second Amendment rights or something that has a historical perspective. And this one is not only do I have a historical perspective of the corruption, it's very personal to me because I work closely with people who ended up becoming felons. When I became an attorney and then went to work for the legislature, I thought, well, at least I'm not working with criminals. And it turned out that, well, I was. And a lot of criminals are very likable people. They're just criminals. But you're right in that the attitude has been, it's all over, there's nothing to see here. And, of course, the main thing that's in people's minds now is the guilty pleas by Jeremy Hutchinson, one of the governor's nephews in the legislature, and he had taken bribes disguised as legal fees, and he had taken campaign funds and converted it to personal use. And prior to that, there was a recent string of some people either being convicted or pleading guilty to dealt with general improvement funds for a private college and got kickbacks. Another one was also dealing with these grants, and he ended up pocketing a lot of money. And then there were some people who had been in the legislature, one being former Senator Henry Hank Wilkins, fourth, and they reached back and grabbed bribes that he had taken several years ago as part of his big scheme. And then there was a former legislator who became a lobbyist. Of course, he became a lobbyist because of his connections, and he was also involved in this Medicaid provider scam. So it's kind of hard to say that it's isolated, considering all the different people who've been convicted just recently. But that's pretty much been the attitude. And there were speeches made, I'm not sure by who, but there were speeches made at the beginning of the legislature this year, pretty much saying the bad guys have been caught and we're all good guys and we're being blamed for this stuff. Let's carry on and enjoy ourselves here and make some minor tweaks and move on. But that really only works if you only look at the headlines from the last few days. When you have a longer perspective of this, it's not a matter of just a few bad guys. It's been a continual flow of bad guys, of people being convicted. I wrote an article for Conduit 2 years ago when John Woods and Mike O'Neill were convicted, and I cited that I had worked with 16 politicians who had become felons, and in that group was a governor, an attorney general, a secretary of state, and a treasurer. And then the other 12 were legislators. In fact, one of the constitutional officers, the treasurer, had also been a legislator. So I'd worked with all these people, and there was 16. Well, the numbers have grown to 20 because of the recent convictions. And so when you look at that, that's since 1980. So you're talking about a 40-year period. If you did an average, and if it carried forward, you could expect every 2 years somebody, some statewide politician or legislator or former legislator is going to be convicted of a felony. So it's not an isolated event. There's all these convictions out there, and that repeats itself over and over again. And then there's also the responses, and there have been basically some window dressing on ethics in the last 2 years. But when you go back to previous scandals, there was window dressing then that had so many loopholes in it that it really didn't mean anything.
Right.
So, it's one of those things where you're not going to be ever to address problems if you're not willing to actually put restrictions on politicians, any additional restrictions other than some minor, just, run-of-the-mill stuff that's not going to do much. And, when I was there, I take that back. I said there was 20 people. There was actually some that I knew that had been legislators, but prior to me coming there. There was a couple from the 70s. And one day I had this lobbyist and this guy who was looking for a grant come to the office. They'd been sent by a legislator to try to get some grant money set up, get some flow of income to this guy. And I got to thinking, there's something about these guys. They left the office. There's something about these guys. And I got to thinking, oh, yeah, both of them served in the legislature in the 70s. And I got to think, oh, yeah, both of them are felons. And they were both likable guys. But so that's another 2 there. And then I'm not counting the ones that pled down to misdemeanors. I mean, one of them that pled down to a misdemeanor, it stolen money, not from the state, but from his private business. And, he said, well, sure, I stole some money and spent it on my girlfriend, but I also spent some of it on Bibles. So he's kind of a unique fellow there. But there was a period of time when I had lots and lots of people that were under indictment or had become felons coming into my office. I had one representative come in, and he said, Ferguson, I'm not guilty, but the FBI is just wearing out my family. I just got to put this to an end. I'm going to plead guilty. The next day, he pled guilty. About 2 weeks later, another legislator came in. He was visiting us basically before his guilty plea, and he had a very different response. He said, Ferg, there's not a thing I've got that they can get. He didn't say he wasn't guilty. He said they couldn't get it. Well, they got his time. He spent some time with them, but those are some things. Now, this list of 20, not everybody was still in office when they did these things, or in office. There was one that actually committed his felony in the way he conducted his election, trying to buy votes. So he actually committed that before he became into the legislature. And there were some that committed them after they left. There was a couple who became state employees and then gotten involved in embezzlement or theft, and it got them too. But most of that list is people that were in office when they committed some act of corruption, usually having to deal with something to do with their duties.
Right. And now you mentioned, this has been the corruption of my generation. This has been the first batch of corruption that, my age people have seen come out. But you've, highlighted that this is a generational, continuous, lifetime problem. And so this new legislation that they've come out with, they've boasted it in the headlines. It's ethics, it's great, we've reformed it. But when you really get into the meat of it, it doesn't do much. Frankly, it rolled back, you know, the restrictions so much that some of the things that Jeremy Hutchison is in trouble for would have made it legal for him to do. Now, this is not a new, as you called it, window dressing. So, what did this type of loophole legislation look like, generations ago or decades ago?
Okay, yeah, it is a kind of a repeat. Now, this time was a little bit special in that on the campaign funds, they came in. Oh, we're going to make it tough. We're going to add a few more $1,000s to the penalty for taking campaign funds for personal income. But the meat of it was this Trojan horse, and this has been the theme of legislation, especially in the last few years, is you put out something in the title, and then you include this Trojan horse that does an entirely different thing. And what they did was say, well, Jeremy, you could have taken all this money, not for your girlfriend, but you could have taken it to pay off bills that you would have called office holder expenses, and you still had money to spend on your girlfriend. And that is kind of unusual. But as far as the legislation that has dealt with other ethics issues, it's the loophole mentality. It's a mentality that comes out of, hey, we're all good guys here, and you really don't know what your colleagues are up to, but you just assume you like them, therefore everybody's good. It's not like when you have bookkeepers. They've added more and more restrictions on bookkeepers because they have a tendency to embezzle money, but they don't do that with the legislators. Let's go back. One of the big scandals of my time was in the 1990s when a group of legislators came up with a new program representing children, and I think it was children in divorces. It was a guardian ad litem program, and they figured out a way to control it so that all the buddies got the contracts. And so there was a group of them that went, some went to jail, some were tried, and some just looked like they had gone on a fasting diet because they looked so worried and poor during all the investigation. But as a result of that, there was a little bit of legislation. One dealt with relatives working for the state, and it kind of sounded tough, but whether or not, well, the deal is that they have to report it now. It's supposedly approval, but there's never been anybody rejected. So it's just, you need to approve it, get it approved that you're going to have this relative working. And there have been some that have forgotten to do that, and there was no problems. They took care of it. But the other part, and the part that goes back to Jeremy Hutchison, is that there was a Senate rule that was going to clamp down on attorneys who essentially were representing their clients in legislative matters. And that's directly what Jeremy Hutchison was doing. Well, before that became final, and there are folks around that worked on this thing, some notable Republicans that worked on this thing, but before they could get it passed, there was an exemption put in there that basically said, well, it's not a problem if what you're doing would affect a segment of the population, not just your client, which means none of it. There's always a general group out there that would be affected by any legislation. So it doesn't mean anything. It's just built-in loophole. With that being there, when Linda Collins was Linda Collins Smith at the time, tried to put in a bill to say that you cannot represent your clients before the legislature. Uh, uh, when she tried to get that passed, the chief opponent was Jeremy Hutchinson, and so it was defeated. And we come along a couple more years, we find out, one of his big problems is he was taking these legal fees to represent clients that were really disguised as bribes, which if he couldn't even represent them, it would have blocked all that off. But he was taking these bribes, so it was just an ongoing thing. Well, they didn't want to do that, so the Senate came along with a rule. They said, well, you're going to have to disclose some more relationships here and more categories. And it started out like, well, this is going to be an improvement. But it turns out that it's only a Senate rule. They can ignore the rules. And when they had an opportunity to come back and say, hey, let's pass this as a law so it applies not just to the Senate, but also the House, and that we can actually have the Ethics Commission, this impartial group, look at things, and we can have the Ethics Commission's investigatory staff look at these things. Well, they didn't do that. They just said, well, we've got a Senate rule, don't worry about it. So there's some additional disclosure, but it's not even filed with the rest of the disclosure, so you can't go in and do a search and find information on a senator on this additional stuff. You have to actually request a hard copy of the information. Again, it's just one of those things of just doing as little as possible and calling it done. And that's not going to work. Another ethics legislation from 2017 was one that would require Medicaid providers, that's health-related businesses that receive Medicaid funds for their services, it would require them to report their financial relationships with legislators. Well, that was defeated too. The legislator didn't have to do anything. The burden was on the Medicaid provider, and of course, many of the convictions of recent have been legislators involved with Medicaid providers or healthcare individuals. And we had the chairman of the health committee in the House who was a partner with a nursing home owner, and nobody knew it.
Right.
It came out later. So there's not really any change. So I would expect that we'll still have the same FBI coming in and picking people up every 10 years. There'll be another group of them.
Okay.
There's just no commitment to putting more restrictions on themselves when they view themselves as the good guy.
Well, we're going to have to wait this one out and see. Hopefully we'll get somebody in there with, the guts, if you will, to come in here and actually give something some teeth. Mr. Ferguson, it has been a real treat to have you on today, and I'm very thankful that you came on with me, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Okay.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
And we'll be right back after this break.